Hey! My name's Helianthus Cryptid, or Nephilim if you'd prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is the penultimate chapter of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. I'm actually a little bit scared going into this chapter with how everything is ramping up. Before I begin the chapter, here are the trigger warnings. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers. If you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to one of my other videos, such as the Adro series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 9. The stars look very different today. Akashi had recognized Oikawa as soon as he walked through the door. Well, not exactly as soon as he walked through the door, because Akashi caught a glimpse of a tall frame, blonde hair and glasses, and thought, he looks like Tsukishima. And then he saw his face and thought, oh shit, that's Oikawa Toru. Oikawa was there replying to an ad Akashi put out offering up his spare room. He had been in his second year of university and was looking for someone to be his new roommate after he managed to snag a small 2-bedroom apartment. His first choice had been Bokuto, but because he'd taken up the offer to join the Misby Black Jackals, he'd been in Osaka at the time. Akashi was vaguely aware that Oikawa was supposed to be missing, and judging by the bleached hair, he wasn't planning on being found. But he didn't ask. Nobody went missing because they wanted to be asked questions, and luckily for Oikawa, Akashi didn't consider himself curious. So they moved in together, and it worked nicely. Oikawa was pretty organized, he cleaned up after himself, and knew to keep quiet when Akashi was studying. He never told Oikawa that he knew who he was either. They never talked about high school, and Oikawa certainly never talked about their shared interest in volleyball. In fact, he seemed to actively avoid it. Akashi liked to watch Bokuto's games whenever they were on TV, and the few times Oikawa had walked in and seen Miya Atsumu's jump serve or Bokuto's spikes, he'd walked straight back out. He'd gone so far as to grumble obscenities under his breath at the Schweiden Adlers game, Ushijima Wakatoshi's face staring back at him from the TV, devoid of any emotion. But overall, living with him was a pleasant experience. There were next to no arguments between them, and there were no horror stories about parties or fires or a psycho roommate poisoning his tea, which Akashi was super grateful for. Oikawa didn't talk much, though, except when Awaizumi Hajime came up, and then it was like he couldn't shut up. And it was then that Oikawa came to life. When he talked about Awaizumi Hajime, his eyes became less dull, and his face opened up with a bright smile and a loud laugh. He looked less like a corpse and more like a person in love. And even though Akashi liked when things were quiet, he found that he much preferred Oikawa happy. He realized pretty early on that Oikawa must have gone through a lot in the time he was missing. It had been a year since he'd vanished when Oikawa moved into Akashi's apartment, and a lot could have happened in that year. So it was always a nice surprise when Oikawa's face lit up as he told stories about his childhood with Awaizumi. Akashi remembered the first time it had happened, and how the sudden shift was so jarring he'd been left speechless. He'd been driving Oikawa to a checkup at one of the clinics nearby, and he'd been chattering on and on about Awaizumi and how he used to do things like that for him too. He used to complain all the time about me injuring myself. Oikawa rolled his eyes with a soft smile on his face. But I could tell he liked looking after me. He tried making me milk bread when I got sick one time. Have I already told you that story already? He hadn't told Akashi that story, and he hadn't told it since, because no matter how much Oikawa talked about Awaizumi, He never once ran out of stories. They were always different. Sometimes he didn't even tell stories, but pointed out random things that reminded him of a Wizemi. Oikawa had reached down to pet an alley cat once, and it had scratched 4 long lines down his hand. Akashi was sure that he still fed it leftovers to this day, after he'd lovingly named it Iwa-chan. "You should go and see him," Akashi had suggested one day at dinner. "You clearly miss him, and nothing's stopping you." Oikawa's smile dropped quickly from his face, and he lowered his chopsticks back down to his plate. No. He had said it so bluntly that Akashi reeled back in shock. "Why not? You always look so happy when you talk about him." Oikawa sighed like he'd explained it 1,000,000 times, and Akashi was choosing to forget. "I never want to see him again." "Why not? Did you guys have a fight or something?" Akashi took a sip from his glass and watched Oikawa glare at his food. "Sort of," he said, "but there's more to it than that." Akashi wondered if a Wizemi felt the same way Oikawa did, because Oikawa seemed like he loved a Wizemi with everything he had. If a Wizemi reciprocated his feelings, Akashi couldn't imagine what kind of pain he was going through, not knowing if Oikawa was alive or dead. "So, what happened?" he asked. He didn't expect Oikawa to start crying, but he did. Loud sobs shook his body. It sort of looked like a ghost had grabbed him by the shoulders and was moving him around. "Because I don't want to see him," he pushed, his tears falling into his dinner. "Just leave it alone." Akashi knew there was more to the story. He knew that something must have happened, because Oikawa was so in love with a Wizemi that sometimes he thought that he could feel it himself. But he didn't push, because he didn't consider himself curious. According to Akashi, Oikawa had moved out of their apartment over half a year ago. It wasn't surprising that they had just missed him, because that's what they seemed to be great at. Fortunately, Akashi and Oikawa were still in contact, and he had Oikawa's current address. But because they had gone straight to Tokyo after Suga left work, they decided to go the next day instead. Finding a few days where the 3 of them didn't have to work was hard. In fact, it hadn't even been possible. A Wizemi had to ask someone to cover his weekend shifts, and Daichi called in to work saying he had the flu and wouldn't be able to come back until Monday. Suga thought that the Oikawas were taking over his life. Slowly but surely, all of his free time had been dedicated to either finding Oikawa Toru or staying after school with Oikawa Kaito. But it wasn't like he was mad. He had been the one who wanted to find Oikawa. He'd known what he was getting himself into. Besides, what other excuse would he have to go to Tokyo for a weekend with his friends? They had checked into a hotel as soon as they got there, a small room each, and then they'd gone to Akashi's. It had been surprisingly uneventful, finding his address. Daichi had simply asked Kuro, who asked Bokuto, who asked Akashi if they could come by to talk to him about Oikawa, and he'd agreed. So after they talked with Akashi, they went back to their hotel and got changed into their pajamas, ready to sleep a little early. That is, until Suga realized how hungry he was. It was his stomach that led him to the convenience store, 5 miles away from the hotel room, dragging Daichi and a Wizemi with him in their pajamas. He leaned against the bike rack, his plaid pajama bottoms doing nothing to keep out the cold of the metal. The weather had been hot all day, but after the sun went down, the chill began to creep in. "Remind me again why we didn't get room service?" A Wizemi hopped up and down on the balls of his feet, arms clenched tightly around himself. Suga felt a shiver run down his spine as he tucked his arms through the armholes of his t-shirt, trying to shelter them from the outside air. "Because we all have shitty paying jobs, and it's expensive," he said and looked through the window of the convenience store. "And why are we standing out here when we could be in there?" Awaizumi pulled the sleeves of his sweater over his hands and scrunched up the cuffs from the inside. "I'm freezing my balls off." "Daichi will be out in a second." Suga hoped that saying it out loud would manifest it. Awaizumi's bouncing halted for a second. "Has he asked you out yet?" "Not yet," Suga muttered. "You think he will soon?" Awaizumi's laugh came out like a huff. "Yeah, probably. I can practically see him psyching himself up whenever your back is turned." Suga bit his lip and looked through the window again. Daichi was reading the ingredients on the back of a chocolate bar. His eyebrows scrunched together like whatever was written on the wrapper had ended his bloodline. "He's cute," Suga said, and watched Daichi under the fluorescent lights. He put the chocolate bar back on the shelf and picked up the bar next to it. "You two are hopeless," Awaizumi said. "You know he likes you. What's stopping you from just asking him out?" Suga turned back to Awaizumi after a final, lingering look at Daichi at the till. "I want him to be ready to do it himself. To make sure he actually wants it and it's not something that happened because we came back into each other's lives. You know?" Awaizumi muttered another tiny, "Hopeless," and they both turned to the opening glass door. Daichi lifted a plastic bag full of snacks higher and waved it around a little. "We set to go?" Suga's arms shot back out of the holes in his shirt. He took the bag and opened it up, peering at the contents. Satisfied, he grinned. "Yep." They fell into step next to each other, the three of them walking in silence. The headlights of passing cars blinded them only briefly before moving on out of sight. Awaizumi's head dipped back and his Adam's apple bobbed up and down as he swallowed. Suga nudged him. "You good?" he asked. Awaizumi's face came back down from the sky, and he looked at Suga for a second. Suga already knew that the answer was no. Awaizumi wasn't good. He hadn't been since before Suga got to know him. He remembered seeing him around sometimes, looking at nothing like they had the answers he was looking for, in the grocery store or at the park. He didn't seem as bad as he used to, but the heavy bags under his eyes and the frown lines on his forehead told a different story. "Yeah," he answered, and looked back at the sky. Suga looked up with him, seeing nothing but city lights and dark clouds. They got back to Daichi's hotel room with rumbling stomachs and tired eyes. It was late enough to be completely dark out, but not late enough to feel as exhausted as Suga did. The snacks Daichi bought were mostly of the healthy kind, cereal bars and plastic tubs of sliced fruit, but Suga was still grateful for them. They talked with one another quietly as they ate, digesting what they'd found out from Akashi. They definitely found out worse, but thinking about how close they were to actually solving the case was a little surreal. "I think I'm gonna head back to my room," Awaizumi said after most of the snacks had been eaten, and he wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. "I'll see you guys in the morning." "Night," Suga acknowledged. "See you tomorrow." Daichi picked up the wrappers and put them into the bag from the convenience store. He threw it off to the side of the bed and sat with his left side against the headboard, watching Awaizumi pick up his things and leave. The soft click of the door shutting engulfed them in silence. It was nice, but a part of Suga missed Awaizumi and his blunt words. Of course, he absolutely adored Daichi, and as much fun as it was to watch him shuffle around a point with his hand stuck on the nape of his neck, and his nervous laugh, He liked how everything a wise me said was uncomplicated. Because there were certain things that Suga didn't want to wait for Daichi to say, but he knew he had to. He knew that if he lost his patience with Daichi and said something that the other might not have been ready to hear, they might not go back to how they were before. Before was what he had started to call the time before Oikawa's case. Before he had forced Daichi back into his life and had the most fun he'd had since Nationals. Which was an awful thing to think. Oikawa was gone, but Suga was having fun. And Suga wasn't blind. He saw the way the tips of Daichi's ears turned red when they touched. It had always been like that, but it only took until recently for him to notice. Suga figured that his previous oblivion was just teenage insecurity in disguise. When he was 17, he saw the moles on his skin and his weird grey hair and thought it was unappealing. He didn't think that Daichi, broad, muscular Daichi, with his tan skin and toned body, could have been attracted to him. Not him when Asahi and Kyoko were right there. But now he was older, and he knew that he was attractive. The secretary at school sometimes let her manicured hands linger on his biceps when she laughed a little too hard at a joke that was a little too unfunny. And the barista in the cafe he frequented sometimes scribbled their number onto a napkin and slipped it to him. "You don't mind me staying for a while, do you?" Suga scooched towards the headboard and maneuvered his legs so he was sitting crisscross applesauce facing Daichi. Daichi leaned his head to the left so it was hitting the wall, and he gave Suga an exhausted sort of smile. "Course not," he said. "I like the company." They were silent. It wasn't exactly awkward, but it was charged. Not with tension, like Suga secretly hoped, but with anticipation. Or at least something similar. Daichi's hands fidgeted on lap, and he cleared his throat a few times like he was preparing to speak. Suga moved a little closer to him, their faces barely centimeters apart, and he wondered if Daichi was going to confess or if he was trying to figure out a polite way of asking Suga to leave. "Do you want to say something, Daichi?" His voice came out like a whisper, which hadn't been what he had told his brain to do, but interrupting the already established silence seemed like the wrong move. "Actually, kinda," he said. His voice was louder, which was comforting. It made it feel like he wasn't unsure about what he wanted to say. "Well, the floor is yours." Suga was still whispering. He felt like clearing his throat, but didn't want to interrupt whatever Daichi was about to tell him. Daichi laughed. "Yeah." He brushed away invisible dust off his boxer briefs. "I just wanted to tell you something, so..." Suga swallowed thickly and turned his eyes away from the circles Daichi was tracing on his own skin. He looked at Daichi's face, waiting. His eyes darted to the four corners of the room, and Suga watched his face flush pink. "I don't really have a speech planned or anything." Suga could see him clench the polyester of his boxers between his fingers from his peripheral. "But I wanted to tell you that I like you. Like, in the romantic way." Suga sucked in a breath, even though he'd been expecting it. But it felt nice to be told. "I know," he said, and his lips widened into a grin. It was the grin that he used to split his face back when he went to Karasuno, when Daichi would let Suga rest his head on his shoulder on the bus, or when he sometimes adjusted Daichi's shirt collar when it didn't even need fixing. It was the smile that used to make his cheeks hurt so bad, but no matter how much they ached, he couldn't stop, because he was just so happy. It felt nostalgic. And the confession sort of felt like that too. Like it wasn't some huge thing that exploded in his face with a moment of realization. It was like water, slowly and gradually heating up, but inevitably turning to a boil. Because as soon as Suga had seen Daichi for the first time in the gym, the heat had been turned on, and it was finally reaching its boiling point. "You do?" Daichi let out a laugh, and his hand drifted over Suga's, hovering over it. Suga turned his hand over and linked their fingers together. "Mm-hmm." He rubbed his thumb softly over Daichi's, feeling the soft skin on his knuckles. His fingers were thicker than his own, but it wasn't uncomfortable. He thought it was nice having something to grip. "I've known for a while." Daichi squeezed his fingers gently, and leaned his whole body a little closer, like Suga was a magnet, and he was being pulled slowly towards him. "Did Awaizumi tell you?" Almost of its own accord, his free hand came up beside Daichi's cheek, and he gently traced over it with the tips of his fingers. Suga had always thought of Daichi as manly. Even as a 15-year-old, it seemed like Daichi embodied the type of masculine that was in cologne commercials. The type of masculine that TV promised smelled like hunting in the woods with no shirt on. But feeling the peach fuzz on the apples of Daichi's red cheeks tickle the pads of his thumbs, he was reminded how they were barely even men, how they were still so young, and that they'd lost a year they could have spent with each other, but had still managed to come back together. "No," Suga said, and softly let his thumb brush over Daichi's eyelashes. He blinked a few times and closed his eyes gently, with an equally soft smile tugging at his lips. "But we've always been on the same wavelength, so I assumed you felt the same as I did." Daichi snorted softly, and Suga moved his fingers to the tip of his nose. "You like me?" His nose scrunched up under Suga's fingers as he spoke. "Embarrassing." "Oh no." Suga laughed quietly, careful not to disturb the softness that they'd built in the little air that hung between them. "Are you rejecting me?" Daichi's hand unlocked from his own, and creeped its way up to his waist. And then he held it there, rubbing the smallest circles over Suga's sweater. "Sorry, you're just not my type." He opened his eyes again, and Suga had to resist the urge to faceplant into the nearest pillow. He thought of Daichi as cologne commercial masculine, but he was also the cutest person Suga had ever seen. His wandering hand fell from Daichi's face to his chest, feeling the thud of his heart. The beat was fast, and Suga felt his own speed up, because they liked each other. The proof was right under his fingertips. Daichi's hand flexed against his waist and moved to the small of his back. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, pulling Suga closer just the smallest bit. Suga wrapped both hands around Daichi's neck, locking them together. "I thought I wasn't your type." He smiled and watched hickory brown eyes trail down to his lips. "I guess you're the exception," he said, and Suga leaned in closer, pressing their lips together. He thought the kiss was like taking the first sip of tea after coming inside from the cold, the first mouthful heating up his entire body from inside out, in such a comforting way that it just left him with a warm, buzzing feeling. And even though they'd never kissed before, Daichi's lips felt familiar. But that could have been just Daichi. It didn't last long, but Suga didn't mind, because when they pulled away, he got to see Daichi's pupils blown wide and his face burning red. He didn't think he looked any better himself, but it made that light, fuzzy feeling in his chest bubble just a little bit more. "We should go on a date," he suggested, "before we leave Tokyo." Daichi bit his bottom lip for a second and then nodded minutely. "We definitely should," he agreed. "I'm glad you finally told me." Suga leaned his forehead down onto Daichi's shoulder. He knew he wouldn't be able to stay like that for long, but for the moment he enjoyed the feeling of Daichi's breath on the crown of his head. "Me too," he said, and placed another kiss on top of Suga's hair. Suga liked that he could do that now. It made his chest tighten in the best way, and that cheek-aching smile stick to his face just a little bit longer. They stayed like that until Suga got a crick in his neck and his eyes began to droop with sleep. Begrudgingly, Suga woke up when his alarm went off. He cursed out loud, but the stingy attitude that usually accompanied him in the mornings was quickly erased when he realized that Daichi's arms were around his middle, and he smiled into the hotel pillow. He turned around in Daichi's arms and pressed a kiss to his cheek, which was covered in little red marks from the pillow's creases. He groaned and shook his head. "Let me sleep." Suga kissed his cheek again. "We gotta get up." Daichi blew out a raspberry, but opened his eyes. He smiled sleepily at Suga. "Morning," he slurred. "Morning," Suga replied. "Sleep well?" Daichi's eyes slipped closed again. Suga pinched him lightly. "Don't go back to sleep," he said, and Daichi blinked his eyes open again. "We gotta go meet up with Akashi again." Daichi groaned out something incoherent that Suga didn't even think were words and said, "We gotta go out on a date." His arms tightened round Suga and he laughed. "Yeah, so get up." He wriggled out of Daichi's hold and tried to pull him up. Daichi sat forward, rubbing his eyes. "I hate waking up." His hoarse morning voice sent tingles up Suga's spine, and he bit his lip gently, trying to suppress a smile. "We should wake up Awizumi," Suga said and checked his watch. It wasn't terribly early, but they weren't running late. Daichi grunted in what Suga perceived as agreement and threw his legs over the side of the bed. "I feel like he'll castrate us." His eyes searched the floor and picked up a pair of socks. "Really? He seems like a morning person," Suga said and walked over to the door, waiting for Daichi to follow. Daichi walked up next to him and slid his hand into Suga's. Suga squeezed his fingers gently and opened the door. "Holding hands to walk down the hall?" he asked, smiling at Daichi, because he hadn't been able to stop since the night before. "I can't believe we're that couple." Daichi stood so close that their interlocked hands barely fit in the space between them. "What? It's not like anyone's around to complain." He shrugged. "Which room is Awizumi's?" Suga pointed to a room on his left. "This one." He knocked on the wood. "Iwa!" He called out and listened for a reply. There was light shuffling on the other side, and the door opened wide. "Morning," he said, rubbing his eyes, looking down after dropping his hands to his sides, and looked directly at their hands. "Oh, it's about time." Suga watched Daichi's face twitch a little. He knew that if one of their kohai had said that, they would be shitting themselves in anticipation of Daichi's reaction. But this was Awizumi, so Daichi just looked away, embarrassed. "Shut up," he said, and Suga nudged him with his shoulder. "Let's go get ready and meet up with Akashi," he said when Daichi turned back to them. A little while later, while Iwaizumi and Daichi went searching for Oikawa's new apartment with Akashi, Suga had decided to break off from the group with the excuse that he was looking for a place to have dinner later on. It's not like he was doubtful they would find Oikawa, it was just that after a lot of false alarms throughout their search, he was trying not to get his hopes up. So instead of going with Iwaizumi, Daichi, and Akashi to Oikawa's apartment, Suga went looking for something else. A place where he could take Daichi on a date. He was a little conflicted about his priorities, but they were in Tokyo together, and they didn't have to worry about work. The timing seemed ideal. He had asked Akashi about a few places that would be nice date spots before they'd split up, and he was slowly beginning to feel the anticipation sink in. He wasn't sure when he started liking Daichi because their time in high school sort of meshed together, and it was so long ago that he couldn't pinpoint an exact time. But he knew it had been years. The feelings had gone dormant during the before, but every now and then Suga would be hit with a dream or an old picture or just a wave of memories that he'd reminisce on for a while. So he was pretty ecstatic to be going on a date with Daichi. Out of all the places Akashi had named as good date spots, Suga had picked the planetarium. It was super cheesy to go stargazing on a first date, but that was sort of the appeal. To have that really cliché first date that was seen in movies and books that ensured the two protagonists ended up together. Suga was thinking of it like a good luck charm. He walked into the large building, suppressing his oohs and ahs at the space art, the modern interior, and the star-themed decorations. Nobody was at the ticket counter, so Suga looked up at the model solar system on the roof, and reminded himself to thank Akashi for the suggestion. "How can I help you today?" Suga came back down to earth and watched someone step behind the ticket counter. He made eye contact with the employee from across the desk, and his heart stopped in his chest. He shook his head lightly and felt the beginnings of a cold sweat form his arms. "Shit," Oikawa muttered back. His eyes were as wide as saucers. "Fuck, you were on the Karasuno team." The bleached hair Suga had heard so much about was replaced with a brown so dark it looked black. He also wore a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, but Suga could very clearly tell that this was Oikawa. Suga nodded. "And you're supposed to be missing." He watched Oikawa swallow. He adjusted his face and put on a polite smile Suga had never seen him wear before. "How can I help you, Mr. Refreshing?" Suga blinked at Oikawa's shift from startled, borderline panic to someone who embodied, "I'm only being nice because I care about my job." "I came looking for you," he said, "because you needed to be found." Oikawa glanced around. The lobby was empty beside them, and Suga felt the nervous energy around Oikawa seep into his own skin. "Why," Oikawa asked, "why did you come looking for me? We weren't even friends." Suga thought about telling him Iwaizumi was with him, but based on what Akashi had told them the day before, Oikawa didn't want to speak with him. "I'm Kaito's teacher," he said instead. "He's not doing well at school, and I think it's because of you." Oikawa raised an eyebrow. "You went through the trouble of reopening a cold case just because my nephew was doing badly at school?" Suga shrugged. At the time, that was exactly his reasoning, but deep down he knew that he also used it as an excuse to speak with Daichi again, even if it had led to a brief falling out between them in the beginning. Oikawa picked up a pen and twirled it between his fingers. "Well, I'm afraid your mission was in vain." "You mean you aren't coming back home?" Suga moved closer to the desk. "Even though your selfishness had repercussions on your nephew." Oikawa glared at him from the other side of the desk.
What I mean is that my family knows where I am. My sister comes to visit me every week. It was her choice not to tell her kids.
And Suga felt his heart sink because he realized it was true. Kaito had said something like that the day Suga decided to search for Oikawa. He'd said that his parents went away almost every week and would come home tired and sad. And that's why he never bothered them. Suga felt his heart clench tightly. He had spent countless hours looking for Oikawa when Kaito was worrying about his parents for no reason. And then he wondered how he was going to tell Iwaizumi. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. I am so happy with all the Daisuga fluff that is in this chapter, and holy shit, did the ending surprise me. I can't wait to record the next chapter. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, or Rorian, on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like, and you subscribe to the channel, and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so, though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!